In this episode, Andrew and I are talking with Clint Heacock from the Mindshift podcast. We're talking about leaving faith, why people like us do leave Christianity, what would bring us back into Christianity, and what some of the responses are to Christians on us leaving Christianity. I think this is a very important conversation to be had because my experience lately of engaging with Christians on the subject is there are a large number of Christians who simply don't get it, don't understand our reasons, they don't agree with our reasons, they don't even believe the reasons that we give for leaving, not to mention some of the I don't know how to phrase it without sounding unpleasant, but some of the nasty things that are just simply said about people who leave Christianity. So this is an extremely important conversation to be had. Not only are we doing this podcast episode, but I featured this week on the Skeptics and Seekers podcast where we did 2 episodes of that with David from Skeptics and Seekers. Sarah joined us, and there's also Dave, the Graceful Atheist, who I hope most of you will be familiar with. So go over to the Skeptics and Seekers podcast and hear a very similar episode over there with a different panel talking about much the same subject. I also recommend that you go and listen to the Graceful Atheist podcast where Dave does talk to many people who have left the faith, and you'll be able to get a picture of some of the many reasons why people leave Christianity. I also want to recommend the Everyone's Autonomous podcast, which does a very similar thing, but there's a stronger focus on the trauma that's involved with people from that. If you are a Christian and you want to take part in this conversation and you feel that you can do it in a respectful manner, then by all means come along, let's have that conversation. I don't mind you disagreeing with us. What I do mind is you not listening to us. So please come along. This is an invitation to any and all. Let's have that conversation. Let's increase the understanding of everybody on why people leave and why they won't go back. We're talking today about people leaving Christianity, why they leave, could they go back, will they go back, why won't they go back. Our guest today is Dr Clint Heacock. I contacted Clint partly because he is host of the Mindshift podcast, but also because he wrote a rather interesting list of multiple reasons why people leave the faith. So welcome, Clint. Welcome to our podcast, and tell us about yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I'm glad to have, met up with you guys. Obviously, talking before we hit record, we've got a lot in common, haven't we? So, yeah, I'm really glad to be on your show. Yeah,
well, it's good to have you.
Yeah, I'll give you the short 30-second version. I was a pastor while I was going to Bible college and seminary in the Portland, Oregon area, and then we closed that church down, which is a long story for a lot of reasons, but I got really burned out in ministry. And as I was coming off the back of that experience, I came over here to the UK to do a PhD because I was going to get into academics, getting back into teaching, which I then did for about another 7 or 8 years after I finished my doctorate. But I was deconstructing at the time, so I was increasingly having problems. And of course, coming off the back of that really rough church experience, that led me into progressive Christianity, guys like Brian McLaren, Rob Bell, Donald Miller. So I was already questioning a lot of things. So it's been a long journey of really walking away from it. And I guess disentangling, that would be the word. There's a lot of entanglements, isn't there? Emotionally and psychologically and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for that. How long ago did you arrive in the UK then? That must have been almost 10 years ago now.
More than that, yeah. It was in 2016. Yeah, no. I lose track.
There's a wrong digit in there somewhere.
Wrong digit, yeah. 2006? I can't remember. We've been here 14 years, so however many years that is.
We need to do something about your accent then.
Yeah,
it's like you're converting from Apple to Android, but you haven't really given it up yet.
It's true. It's funny because my youngest daughter, she lived in Sheffield for a long time, so she picked up a lot of bizarre accents, but she also had a roommate that was from Cornwall, so she's got Yorkshire, she's got Cornish, she's got a Chester. So, yeah, but most of us still retain our American accents, even though we've been here 14 years.
Yes,
I moved from Hampshire, which is North Hampshire, which is a relatively posh area of the southern UK, close to London, into Somerset, right down in the west.
Mm-hmm.
And the accent changes a lot. All the clipped Queen's English is completely out the window, and there's some very odd phrases that happen. I've been down here about 8 years now, and I just can't get used to it.
You can't get used to. I think what I've learned being here that long is not so much the accents, but the British sort of slang. That's the things the typical things that you use. Or because I teach construction now, I teach carpentry and joinery and multi skills at a college here in Northwest England, and so I have to use the terms and phrases that the learners would understand. I have to measure in meters and millimeters, and everything's metric, isn't it, as opposed to feet and inch. So. You have to make those changes as you have to.
Oh, getting those measurements wrong in the construction industry comes up with interesting results.
Yeah, you don't want to make a mistake.
My employer provides products to the construction industry, so there may be some things that we're familiar with on that one.
I'm sure there will be.
Anyway, sorry, Andrew, you're going to say something interesting on subject, weren't you?
Almost certainly not. That's either interesting or on subject. You mentioned in the run-up to the show, I realized just how much North Wales had influenced you from a sort of colloquial standpoint in the run-up to the show. You mentioned something starting tomorrow at 5:30. And when you said 5:30, the first thing I thought in my head was, well, that's 2:30. It's not 5:30, right?
That's exactly the point. We've just picked up those British phrases, and you understand exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's what, instead of saying 5:30, we'd say 5:30.
Yeah,
and everyone just knows what you're talking about.
It's the right way to say it. It's 5:30. So drop the past. It's 5:30.
Okay.
And I have to write my dates and everything differently.
Right.
Properly.
Oh, right.
Properly,
right.
not differently.
Right.
Properly.
Year, months, and all that, instead of the American way of months. And I don't even know anymore. I'm so confused. I have to write so many dates in the workbooks for the students.
Okay. So do you spell color properly?
Well, I have to. In my PhD, I had to go with the UK spelling, otherwise it wasn't going to pass. So I just switched my word processor to UK English, and so every time I didn't use an S or a U or something like that, then it would flag it up.
And does it hurt not using the Z key so much?
Well, it's funny because they said actually you can get away with it in academics over here in the UK, but yeah, I've just given that up. That's not even a hill worth dying on anymore. No point.
Okay. I think the true test of your conversion to Britishness is, how do you pronounce that lightweight alloy that they make planes and some cars out of?
Oh, you mean aluminum?
Look,
I still can't say aluminium.
Right. No, your accent is fine, and Windows is a virus.
Yeah. Well, every time I teach my class, when we get into the plumbing section, I say solder, and they say solder.
Yes.
So someone's got to correct me every time I say that when we, So yeah.
They also call them routers and not routers.
Yeah, routers. Exactly.
Well, what's wrong with these guys?
I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
because you drive a route between place A and place B.
No, you don't.
That's what it is.
No, a route is something violent. A route is a journey that you take.
See, it's already started.
Yeah. Matthew and I have been at this for a while. I am sure that at some point he is going to convert to the right way of seeing things, which is getting rid of all the Microsoft products, joining the Apple team. He's going to have an American accent.
We'll see the light.
Right. Maybe not a Southern accent. I don't think I'll get him to go that far.
Don't go that far.
The day I manage to slip Jarl into a conversation naturally is the day I get a knife and put it into my throat.
That's true.
Okay, you deserve it for pronouncing y'all quite the way you did. I don't think I could say it the way you did. That was really impressive.
It was too posh, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. It didn't have enough fresh off the turnip truck about
All right.
it, really. So okay, Matthew, somewhere there's a list of things that we really wanted to talk about and not bore our listeners with
they've switched off already anyway. The real
They're already
hardcore
gone.
ones, the only ones that are left now.
The 3 hardcore ones.
That's right.
Get to the article, for God's sake.
Let's get to your list. So
Yeah.
Clint, you wrote a blog post titled "What Happens After People Leave the Church." 2 years ago, 18 months ago, you wrote this. So listeners, if you go and search literally what happens after people leave the church, you're very likely to find that blog post. If you throw Clint Heacock or Mindshift podcast into that search phrase, you're much more likely to hit it. So tell us about this list, Clint. What is the purpose behind it? What does it serve, and how has it matured over the past 18 months?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's actually on Medium. If you go on medium.com and do a search, that's where you can find the article. I actually wrote this article goes back about probably 4 or 5 years ago, but I posted it on Medium a couple of years ago. I can see now it's the 30th of October 2018 when it was posted on Medium, but it was on my website probably a couple of years before that.
Okay.
But what it was about is I was kind of focused on my own deconstruction and my own journey out. And I guess I had this limited view that my story was the only one. That was the only possible path. But I was part of a Facebook group for it used to be called the Evangelical Podcast. I'm not sure if it's still running anymore, but I was in that group for a long time, and we used to get into a lot of discussions. There was probably about 4,000 or 5,000 people in that group when I was a part of it a couple of years ago. Oh. And I used to love I'm a teacher. I can't help it. I love to start discussions and dialogues and get people involved in chats and things. So I started dropping these questions in the group about, since you've left the church, what's your path? What's your journey been? Let's just talk about it. And off the back of that Facebook thread came this article, because I started getting so many responses and they were so different. I thought, okay, again, the academician in me, I've got to categorize this and kind of write this stuff down. And so these responses on the article are actually mostly from people within the Evangelical Facebook group. And these are the responses. I just started kind of putting them into a spectrum as I started to see it. What happens after people leave the church? And it's not just one single answer. There's a lot. I've come up with 16 different kind of possible paths, and there's more being added all the time. I started off with about 8, so I added 7 or 8 more as I got more and more responses. So to me, it's absolutely fascinating.
It looks like, just so that you know, if you've still got friends in the evangelical community, the podcast is still up, and I
think it is.
Still
went
up
off
and
air for a
content.
while. That was that's another long story, but when it went off the air, the group was getting kind of unsafe and, in my view, kind of toxic. I left the group, and so I don't know what's happening in that community much anymore. I've switched more onto focusing on cult psychology, talking to people out of cults. So I've broadened out into this whole other spectrum from when I started about 2 or 3, 4 years ago.
I know that I was listening to Mindshift in the run-up to Mindshift podcast in the run-up to the show, and one of the things that I found intriguing about your podcast is how much background research you've done into cults to identifying various aspects of cults and ways to look at cults from a number of academic standpoints. The BITE acronym, just as a for instance. And so I hope the listeners will take that to heart, because if they have an interest in what it means to deconvert from a cult-like environment, or if they need help and they're on their way out, they're deconstructing, you've got some podcasts there that they should listen to. So that's Mindscape Podcast, and our listeners should go and subscribe.
Yeah, and I've actually got some articles on Medium that I've posted where I talk about sort of cult psychology and unpacking some of those other issues. And I think looking back on this article, I can see now I'm tracing my own development, because I was so focused on the deconstruction of my theological beliefs and my sort of system of thinking, that's all I was focused on 2 or 3 years ago. And as I've changed, one of the areas of deconstruction is, as you say, learning the cult psychology of it and going, wow, so that's another piece. Because someone told me, he said, what you got to do is you've got to unpick the conditioning. You've got to understand how you were manipulated, how you were controlled, how you were psychologically managed or whatever in your religion or cult. When you start to do that, then you start to disempower what they did to you, and you can start to rebuild and reconstruct. So that's really been my focus, and that has resonated with a lot of people that are saying, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
After almost 15 years, maybe a little more than 15 years of being an atheist, I found that particular advice to be really good wording of the experience that I'm going through. It's nice to have a discrete phrase to put around the path that you're taking, right? And it's deconstructing your own programming, understanding what a cult did, how you were programmed to, exactly which confirmation biases you're most subject to, and so yeah, it's good advice, and it's I hope some of the listeners will go and subscribe, because I think you've got an interesting view that ought to be listened to.
Thank you.
It's interesting here the word deconstruction passed around, because from my perspective, deconstruction seems to have been the word now that's the adopted word of choice. But a couple of years ago, it wasn't a word that I heard very much. And when I was going through my own, 12 years ago now, I used the word deconversion because it seemed to be the obvious word. I converted to, and then I'm going away. So it's a deconversion. So it just seemed to be the obvious thing. And no spell checker in the world was accepting that as an acceptable word. And on my own personal blog, Confessions of a Yek, I even wrote a post saying, what do I call this thing? Is it deconstruction? Is there a word for it? And I fished around and I couldn't really find a word that made sense. But now deconstruction seems to become the adopted word, and I'm very happy with that. I embrace that word. I think that's a far more accurate word than deconversion. Do you have any thoughts about how we have landed on that word at all?
Yes, the actual word, from what I can understand in linguistics and philosophy, it goes back to Derrida. And that's where you'll find, he's the one, I don't know if he coined that word, but his books are very, very difficult to understand. They're really, he's like a postmodern philosopher or linguist. And he applied this to sort of philosophy and language and arguments. And I think that's where the idea of, because you can actually find deconstructionist interpretations of scripture, so it is a thing even within the Christian biblical scholars and theologians who will say, well, what we're going to do here is we're going to look at 4 or 5 possible interpretations of a passage or a book or something, and we're going to deconstruct the strengths and weaknesses of each one and compare them to each other and sort of break them down, and so that is a thing. It's been going on for a long time in linguistics and philosophy, going back to Derrida. So to look at your own Christian beliefs and say, I'm going to deconstruct them, I'm going to subject them to a pretty severe critique as objectively as I can, that's certainly something that could fit in with this idea of deconstruction, I think.
And very often Christian traditions do all they can do to fight against the idea that you should examine your Christian beliefs very closely. There's a stigma that can be levied against a member of a church who asks too many questions just to avoid the very thing that's facing Christianity now, a lot of deconstruction.
Absolutely. Well, and what's fascinating about my spectrum of 16 possible sort of paths is it goes from, I kind of set it up from number 1 to number 16, where you've got number 1, they're all deconstructing in some capacity, but it's what do you do about it? Because number 1 on the list is someone who wants to stay a Christian who's, let's say, fed up with sort of the institutional church and wants to remold church in a more of a New Testament sort of Acts sort of church way. And then you go all the way to the end of the spectrum. You got someone who's deconstructed. Maybe they're an angry atheist, or they're an angry theist, or something like that. So you've gone all the way through. So we all tend to respond differently to deconstruction. I know, and I used to be in that camp too for a long time. I was trying to help the church and sort of reform the church, and I was deconstructing, but I really believed in the idea of the church, and I don't see that in fitting in any way to what I'm doing now. I don't want to prop up the system anymore.
Right, and I don't know that it's appropriate for this show, but maybe we can have you back to talk about what Christianity is replaced with, because there are a lot of moral and ethical implications to walking away from whatever Christian denomination you were in. You sort of get all of your views about the world and how to treat other people as a nice tight bundle that you can just adopt, and you don't have to do a lot of thinking about what it means to be an ethical human being, right? You just follow the sort of recipe that your denomination offers you. And there's some real enticement to do that, because when you're following that recipe, you also get that community, right? And when someone walks away from whatever Christian denomination they walk away from, you have to sort of figure out, do I walk away and keep all of those moral and ethical views? Because at least in my experience, I don't know if you had the same experience, but part of deconstructing was questioning all of those things and having to figure out what I really thought about large ethical issues. And so, like I said, maybe we can have you back if you're interested to talk about how you do that, right? And what happened in your particular case.
Well,
what
and
did you replace?
in a healthy way, because one thing I learned from being a part of that group on Facebook was that for first couple of years, it was super helpful, because I found myself in a large community. We all had the same or similar backstories. I'm like, yes, there's thousands of us out here. I'm connecting with all these people, but it became toxic, I think, because we were just kind of festering in the anger and the bitterness and the rage, and rightly so. Like you said, there's a lot of stuff to be pissed off about. But if you stay in that phase for years and years, that can become very unhealthy and toxic.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
You've got to think about where you're going. Someone said to me, what do you want to do with your anger? Do you just want to sit in it forever? That's not necessarily very healthy for your own mental health and for the people around you. So you got to kind of think about, where am I going with this thing?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'd like to challenge upon something you just said earlier, Andrew. I'm not sure that the phrase replace Christianity with something is necessarily a helpful phrase, because for a lot of people, especially those who are suffering from religious trauma, the last thing they want to be told is replace this thing which has really hurt you with something else, because you're kind of sorry, I need to backtrack there because I'm tracking myself into a corner here. I think if you say replace Christianity with something, to a lot of people, they're going to see you're giving value to Christianity. And to those who've been traumatized and hurt by Christianity, if you're giving Christianity value, then they're going to back away from what it is that you're trying to say. So I kind of feel that maybe the phrase replace Christianity with something is not necessarily the right phrase, because I take the view, I've dumped Christianity, I've left it behind. I don't need to replace it with anything. I'm quite good in my life, actually. There isn't a gap there that needs to be filled now that I've dumped Christianity. I've just let go of a backpack that was weighing me down, and I'm better off for it. I don't need a new one.
Yeah, so I mean, we can talk about the semantics of language there, but in the end, I think what you're describing is the emotional response that people have to the harm of Christianity. And Matthew, as you know, I work as a hotline agent for recovering from religion, and we certainly don't quite describe it that way to a caller that calls in and says, "Look, I just need to talk about the fact that I was abused by my Sunday school teacher, or my parents wouldn't let me be educated in a healthy environment because because they had some Christian view about public education, or one of my siblings died because my family was anti-vaxxers. In those kinds of conversations, we don't talk about replacing Christianity. But if you're going to walk away, the practical bit of this is that you do have to deconstruct. And in order to deconstruct, you have to replace those thought processes with something else.
No, that's a fair response.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say, going back to my spectrum, it's about not staying in one path forever. You could start out number 1, go to number 5, end up at number 7 on the list, and still be moving. I can see myself. I started out as that number 1. I was so dedicated to reforming the church, but then no one was listening to me, and I got fed up. Then I moved around. I became an angry theist for a while. I'm more of an agnostic, I guess you could say. I'm still not sure where I'm at on the whole question of God's existence, but I'm certainly not a Christian anymore. So I can see I've moved down the list or down the spectrum, and I'm not saying I'm arrived and I'm never going to move from where I'm at now either.
No, and I'm pretty much the same. I was very low down in the numbers on your list, because I don't think anybody who deconstructs wakes up one morning and goes, you know what, I've had enough, I'm going to leave.
I'm walking away.
It never happens just like that. It's always a creeping sensation of doubt and a seeking to explain those doubts. I genuinely don't believe there is anybody out there who left Christianity because right at the start they wanted to leave Christianity. It's because the whole reason why you buy into it is because you like this, you take comfort from it, you've bought into the whole beliefs, you enjoy the community, you like the rituals, you possibly even enjoy singing the songs. People want to be in it, which is why they're in it, and it's the problems that it causes them, which causes them to question and eventually leave. I don't think anybody ever starts off by looking for a way out. If people just wanted to leave, they'd just not go. So I was definitely up there in wanting to salvage the doubts that I had and remain a Christian. And I'm pretty sure, as I said, most people start off that way. I would classify myself probably as about number 9 on your list now, that I have left the church. I've given up on God, or that's interesting. I'm not sure I'd quite call it that, but I've certainly turned my back on faith. I identify as atheist, and I genuinely don't see how I could go back. I wouldn't necessarily say I've shut the door, but I don't see how that door could open again.
No. There's been a clear break. Yes, and that's what we look at number 9 on this spectrum. Someone who's become sort of an atheist or agnostic. You definitely no longer identify as a Christian. You have no desire to go back. And you're saying, okay, now for sure there's been a break. Yeah. Before I had a hand in it, maybe I was, no more. And then where do you go from there?
Yeah. Do you think there's a case for doing something like the 7 steps of grief or whatever it is, doing the X steps of deconversion where people go through these shifts? Because I certainly went through an angry stage. In those early years after walking away, I carried anger. I was indoctrinated into this false belief. I've wasted so many years on it. I've plowed so many resources into this, and look where I am now. Look where it's got me. I had an awful lot of anger, and then after the anger there was the shame and the embarrassment that, oh no, I used to be a young earth creationist. Really? How could I have possibly been so uneducatedly stupid? And there really was quite a lot of embarrassment around that. And now I'm at peace with my past. I accept it. I can say the phrase, I used to be a young earth creationist, without any sense of anger, embarrassment or irony whatsoever. And I'm comfortable with my past because I can't change it. Do I wish it could have been different? Yes. Can I do anything about it? No. So it's pointless me expending unhelpful emotions on it. but I need to also accept that there are people who are behind me on that road who will go through those emotions, and if there's anything I can do to help them through those troubled waters, I will do what I can.
Well, that's it, because as you go further down my spectrum, you get past that number 9 where you're at, and you start getting into the angry atheist type of phase, and some people just stay there forever, and that's I don't know if that's a helpful place to stay. Like you said, is it? Yes, you need to work through the anger. I've worked through it. I feel grief and loss and sadness and betrayal and all those other emotions, and I was there for a long time. I was so angry, and then someone said to me, "You can't live angry." Well, you can, but it's so unhealthy.
Yeah.
And that's when I started, I go, okay, I need to, that's when the reconstruction piece really started opening up to me. And I thought, okay, what we need to do is actually reconstruct after deconstruction. That's, to me, that's the key. You got to have both of those. Start rebuilding your life, reconstructing your identity, whatever the phrase is. You can't stay angry. Well, you can. That's the sad part. There's a lot of people who just stay angry.
Well, and to be fair to Christianity, you can be an angry Christian just like you can be an angry atheist, right?
Absolutely.
And somehow this just seems to be some part of the unhealthy aspect of human existence, that we can be angry and somehow not get the help we need to say, you know what? Yes, I've been angry, but I can live a more productive, more compassionate, more giving, more engaged, more loving life. All of the things that Christianity would promote. I can do all of that as an atheist if I'm not angry about Christianity.
That's it. What are we so angry about? Because as you say, that what drives so many Christians is this compulsion that God is watching them, that they have to do things for God, for the church, for others, and so there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, a lot of PTSD that comes along with that, religious scrupulosity, religious trauma syndrome, I think someone mentioned. I mean, it's a potentially very unhealthy religion. It really is in terms of mental health. No wonder people are stressed out. God's reading your thoughts all the time. So every thought that I have could be a sin, in addition to every action that I do. So I've got to search my soul, search my heart all the time, because God's watching. God knows every thought. I mean, God, I don't want to live like that anymore, man.
No. Clint, do you listen to the Unbelievable podcast on Premier Christian Radio?
I haven't come across it yet, but it sounds like something to listen to.
Yeah, I make a joke about it. I say it's the only religious podcast that I listen to religiously. Presumably you're familiar with Premier Christian Radio in the UK.
Yes.
Well, Unbelievable is will start off as a Saturday radio show by Justin Brierley, who is a Christian. His wife is a pastor, minister, whatever the right word is. And it migrated to a podcast about 10 years ago. So he's been running this show for about 14 years maybe now.
2006 is when it started.
And so it's about an hour and a half weekly show, and it is usually a Christian and a non-Christian, though sometimes it will be two Christians or something like that. And it's generally, I listen to probably 98% of the podcast. Every now and then there'll be one that I go, no, I just can't do this.
Do it.
But most of the time I will listen to it. Anyway, the reason why I bring it up, they have recently done a couple of shows on how Christianity is good for the world. There was a recent debate with the question, which I think is the wrong question to ask, but the question on the title was, can atheism deliver a better world? And there's a couple of blog posts that followed that on the Premier website, basically making the argument that Christianity is good for us. I think Chris Goswami wrote one of them. He said, whether you believe it or not, Christianity or religion, I can't remember which one he used, is good for you. And my response is to laugh as well. And here we are talking about how people are traumatized by religious experience. And I'll put my hand up. When I was a Christian, I had no idea that such a case of people existed.
Mm.
When I was going through my own deconversion, it took approximately 3 years. I still had no idea. I started following blogs of people who had left, and one of them in particular is an ex-pastor, Bruce Gernster. I've probably butchered his surname. He's an ex-pastor. If you can work out how to spell his surname, I recommend that you search him out. He's got a blog of all sorts of horrible stories. But he was the only name that I'd really come across that was expressing what could be described as trauma from his religion. But there were a couple of people who would regularly comment on his blog, who people would talked about their own religious trauma. But while I was going through my deconversion, those people and those comments didn't really register to me, and it's only now that I'm fully out, and I've been getting over the last 2 years now, I've been very involved in podcasting and finding and digging out more and more ex-believer podcasts and hearing the conversations. There is a ridiculous number of former Christians who are experiencing very, very negative religious trauma. And I had no idea there was this huge number of people out there. And it's only in the recent years that it's really become a solid fact to me that I've seen how many of these people there are. And when I see Christians touting how great for the world and how great for humanity Christianity is, and I balance it on the other hand with my knowledge of all these people, it just doesn't work. And if you're a Christian listening to this, regardless of what else we say, please do go out and pay attention to the number of people who have left Christianity for trauma, and go and read their stories. There are some horrible stories of trauma and of people suffering. And ask yourself the very serious question: what do you do with a religion which drives people away in such a terrible emotional state? Because this is something that I really want Christians to be aware of, because way too many Christians just simply aren't aware of this huge proportion of the population.
Yeah, massive. Well, and it's so ironic. I always come back to that point. This is supposed to be something that is about love and enlightenment and forgiveness and freedom and mental health and everything. And it gives us the exact opposite in so many cases, as you say.
Right.
It's so much trauma and so much, abuse, spiritual abuse, and we're not even touching on the sexual abuse in Catholicism and Christianity, and not just those religions, but the patriarchy, the misogyny, the religious trauma syndrome, the anxiety, the depression, the PTSD, on and on and on. I mean, if God's behind all that, doesn't he know human nature the best so that he can prescribe a system that actually works for everybody? Then where's all this trauma coming from? Well, they'll say it's the humans' fault. It's the people, the leaders they've twisted it. It was something pure, but now it's been twisted. It's just, really, there's always an answer, isn't there?
Well, and that answer somehow always blames the individual. I was going to say you and I, but I don't specifically mean that it blames out atheists, right? It blames the individual, and sort of a case in point here. So I'll stay off of the sexual abuse that is rampant in Jehovah's Witnesses and Catholics and that kind of thing, and just
true.
And just talk about the anxiety that the LGBTQI plus community is experiencing in the Methodist Church right now. The Methodist Church in the United States, well, I guess worldwide, is on the verge of splitting. They only barely survived the vote over whether it was acceptable to live a homosexual life. I mean, Christianity may be the only kind of organization in the world that can harm you sexually without ever touching you.
So much damage. Yeah.
Okay, so that was a little tongue in cheek, but
yeah.
It's hard to see how it can be claimed. Back to your point, Matthew. It's hard to see how Christianity, or maybe it was your point, Clint, so apologies.
Someone.
It's hard to see how Christianity can be considered an overall force for good in the world when you can see entire communities of people, and especially those who are most vulnerable, like children, and yes, I'll say the LGBTQ community, they are vulnerable because they have been ostracized for a long time, and not just by Christianity, but by all three of the major monotheistic
Absolutely.
religions.
I was going to say all the Abrahamic religions are very patriarchal, misogynistic. Well, and going into this issue of dominion theology and all the stuff that's going on right now in the Trump administration with the Evangelical Advisory Board, they're pushing what they call family values, which sounds good, but what they mean is one man, one woman in a monogamous marriage. So heterosexual marriage only, gay marriage, same-sex marriage, absolutely not. Transgender, no way. So you got to unpack all that. They're pushing and driving that agenda for the nation, and that's their Christian worldview. So yeah, going right along with your point.
Yeah. In fact, some of the listeners know I've got a young daughter. She's 8 months old now. And one of the things that we have failed to do in the United States is pass the Equal Rights Amendment from the 70s. And the Justice Department under President Trump has blocked the Archivist of the United States from adding the Equal Rights Amendment. This came up back in the 70s when women needed equal rights. The Justice Department has just in the last few weeks blocked the Archivist of the United States from adding the Equal Rights Amendment to the amendments of the Constitution of the United States. So here's what we're really saying. In our current political religious environment, because I really don't know how to separate them today.
Yeah, not in America for sure.
Right. Okay, so that's fair, and that's
different. It's different in the UK for sure, isn't it? And Europe.
Yeah, I'm buying my plane ticket after we hang up here.
Wait a couple of months though. There'll be fewer. Well, half of us will be dead.
Yeah, well, look, we're headed.
Pandemic strikes.
That's right. But what
I apologize, listeners, for that joke. That was probably in bad taste.
Well, yeah. So what we're saying is, half of the population of the United States, that half that just happens to have two X chromosomes, doesn't deserve equal rights, and we should all be appalled. Should be shouting it from the rooftops. We should be absolutely enraged today in March of 2020 that the United States, as a political power and economic power on the world stage, is willing to not pass the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yeah, and if you do a little bit of digging, you'll find that the people who are pushing that agenda, a lot of them are those evangelical leaders who have the ear of the president. Because you can go back to the 70s, there were three main planks in that, the politicization of the evangelical base. That's what they were trying to do to get Ronald Reagan elected, and some of these other things going on back in the 70s. The ERA was one, homosexual rights and abortion. Those were the three big ticket items. And they were people like Jerry Falwell Sr. with the moral majority and all that. That goes back to 1979. So this thing with the ERA is nothing new. As you say, it goes back decades. And those were the ones driving it back then. And they're still doing it. Guys like James Dobson, Focus on the Family, and all these other people that are involved in politics and have been for a long time.
So what's held it up all these decades from being passed?
Well, they've been pushing that agenda, haven't they?
They have, and that's an interesting question. So, Clint, you'll have to help me with my civics here, because high school government was a long time ago for me.
Long time ago.
But I think an amendment to the Constitution requires a 2/3 state majority. It has to be ratified by 2/3 of states, but it might be 3/4. So one of our listeners can write in or Clint, do you remember whether it's 2/3 or 3/4?
I don't know the actual number, but I know it's been a plank in the evangelical political side, the Christian right, I guess you could say.
Right.
So they've got the ear of they've either had the ear of a particular president or people in Congress or the senators to continue to battle against this legislation for
That's
a long
right.
time, for decades, really.
Right. And so, Matthew, to answer that question specifically, we were close to having the proper state majority a number of times, and some states backed away. I think Wyoming did. I've got a list of what states ratified the ERA and then backed away. There were 4 or 5 of them. So we were right on the verge. And in 2019, so just a few weeks ago, the State House in Virginia, the Virginia State Legislature, approved the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was the final state needed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And it was at that point when we finally got to that. I'm almost sure it's 2/3 majority. When we got to that 2/3 majority, the Trump Justice Department stepped in and said, "Well, it's taking you too long, so we're blocking the Archivist of the United States from adding the Equal Rights Amendment as an amendment to the Constitution of the United States."
Mm-hmm.
As if giving half of the population equal rights should ever have a time limit. Okay. So I guess I'm on record now. But so, Clint, I want to ask you and get away from politics. What kind of atheist are you? Are you the weak atheist? I'm not convinced that there is a God, or are you the strong atheist? There is no God.
I would say I'm more of an agnostic. I would say I'm not sure if there is a God. If there is a God, I've got a lot of questions and problems with that God. But part of it is I'm trying to figure out, am I reacting against the God that I was taught, as a kid growing up and in my church experience? Because I've got a friend who reminds me of that all the time when I'll post something on Facebook, a rant about something. He'll turn around and say, now, what you're actually reacting against is your sort of fundamentalist background, and not all streams of Christianity are certainly like that. So I've got a lot of questions. I've done a lot of writing and thinking about the God of the Bible and, the implications of the way the text presents that God. So I'm still working through a lot of that. I'm not sure if I'm ready to jettison that yet, but if I do have a belief in God, I got a lot of problems with that God.
I'm with you. I was raised on a very conservative God view, right? He's all powerful. He's all knowing. He sits inside your head and watches every thought. Got to tell you, that one scared me the whole time I was growing up. There's a God sitting inside my skull, watching my thoughts like a movie, or however he
recording everything too.
Right, exactly. And so I can say that sometimes I do react pretty strongly to that kind of view of a God. Then I kind of want to ask your friend, if there is a more kind, loving, benevolent creator of the universe, why isn't he stomping out these other views of him? where he's a mean, hateful, bigoted guy in the sky with his thumb on everybody, just waiting to rub us out when we commit the slightest transgression, right?
Yep.
So if there's a kinder God, I want him to show up too. Just make yourself known.
Well, going back to my spectrum in the article, number 11 is sort of a deistic position. And I think that works for a lot of people, because you could go back to the deistic thought and say, there is a God. He created everything, or set it in motion, set the evolutionary process in motion, and then he left. So there is a God, but he's not involved. And that explains a lot of the natural disasters and the coronavirus right now. Why isn't God stopping it? Why did he allow it? Because he's gone. He's fucked off. I mean, he's not around anymore. So you kind of you have your cake and eat it too. I can see the appeal of that deistic sort of view. I mean, I don't personally agree with it, but I can see the appeal, because it gives you a God, but it answers a lot of the problems of evil too. And why doesn't God show up and explain who he is? Because he's gone. He's not around anymore. I don't know where he is.
What view of God did your family present when they were in Zambia when you were a kid? Was it a nice, kind God, or was it more of the sinners in the hands of an angry God kind of God?
Oh, crumbs, I have to remember. For the context behind that question, Clint, is I grew up in missionary environment in Zambia in the 70s.
Oh, very nice.
So my childhood was in Zambia, and then I came to the UK at 18 years old to make my way in the world. I'm most of my God teaching was at school. I went to a boarding school up in the northwestern province of Zambia. And it was a school for missionaries that had quite an American influenced education, which I can pretty much, I see that now. I didn't realize it so much at the time, but I can really see it now. There are a lot of American missionaries in the country. I think there must have been, of a school of about 100 pupils, I reckon possibly 30% were Americans, possibly, I think, around about that. So it was very much, it was a young earth creationist God, and it was a loving God, but it was a Calvinist version of a loving God. And it's very easy to tell a preteen child, that this is a loving God, but looking back at it now, I don't see it. But the school had quite a strong discipline ethos to the point where children were paddled with the equivalent of a wooden spoon, and there were some children who were utterly miserable there. I do remember some children who were utterly miserable, and some friends of mine, I didn't really realize it at the time. I found out years later, but they were only there for 2 terms, and I didn't really understand why. And it wasn't until years later that when I was an adult and I was having a conversation with their father, and he said to me, we were driving the children to school, and one of the children's in the back of the car, and he said, I want to jump out of the car. And he said that just broke his wife's heart, and she in that moment said, this is it, I'm finding another school for the children. And that was why they were taken out from school. And there were other children who just didn't have a pleasant time there. I just got on with it, and I just adapted. I wasn't a rebellious type child. I just accepted what was going on because I didn't know any better. But there were some children who were a bit more rebellious, and they challenged it and questioned it, and they genuinely had a miserable time there. But I can only see that by looking back. I didn't really see it at the time. I just thought that the reason why they're being miserable is because they're being disobedient. That was the only way as a young child I had of interpreting their behavior.
Now, see, that's a fascinating case study, because as you were describing your growing up in Zambia, I was thinking about, why isn't Christian education the best educational experience? It should be, if God's behind it. I was reading through the other day the Bob Jones University student rule book. Don't ask me why. There's a long story. But I started reading, and it's about a 70 or 80 page document. I just kept reading, and I was just dumbfounded at how restrictive and how unbelievably rule oriented this. And this is a university where adults are going to learn the Bible. Obviously, it's a fundamentalist university, Bible college. And I thought, my God, I grew up in Christian schools. It was similar. We had hair codes, and we had dress codes, and we had all these things. I thought, how does that relate to God producing these wonderful adults? We all came out of there with religious trauma, essentially.
Right.
How is that possible? But people, again, will say, well, that's humanity's fault for twisting something that was pure. But yet they're claiming this is God's way of educating children and adults. It's so dysfunctional.
Clint, you'll be familiar with Christian colleges in the United States.
Yeah, I went to Bible college.
Okay, right. Me too. Before I figured out that there's actually better education than that. Different story. I'm gonna leave that one. But I got a nephew, and just recently he attended Pensacola Christian College, so I don't mind.
Yeah. They're even
Okay.
far right than Bob Jones. They think Bob Jones is liberal.
Okay, so you know them.
Oh, I know Pensacola, yeah.
Okay, so I'll just say for the listeners, you were talking about how restrictive Jones is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my nephew, and it's okay, I'll just leave him unnamed because he doesn't deserve to be splashed with my podcasting. But he was attending Pensacola. He was a mechanical engineering student, and in his dorm room, they would not allow him access to things like Khan Academy or to iTunes U. So just for those students who, want to get some real study in outside of class, and they want to watch a college lecture from another professor to sort of help them ground themselves in whatever the material is, whether it's history or calculus or whatever. iTunes U's got good content. He couldn't access iTunes U from his dorm room. He had to go to his uncle's house in order to be able to adequately study.
So it was all blocked basically on campus.
All firewalled.
Yeah.
And it is just it is. I can understand setting up a proxy to block certain kinds of internet content. I don't misunderstand me. I am a big proponent of freedom of speech, and I'm not suggesting that they should. I am suggesting that I understand it, but to block other universities' education content, stuff that is entirely unobjectionable, was just it was shocking.
But it's explainable. It's explainable if you look at it from that, like you were saying, the BITE model. The I, it's an acronym: behavior control, which is one of the markers of cults; information control, which is another marker of cults; thought control, which you got to police your own thoughts. You have accountability groups, and then you have emotional control. And so you could tick off the 4 markers of that Stephen Hassan's model of cults. And Bob Jones fits all 4 of those. Pensacola Bible College fits all 4 of those. They're controlling the flow of information to their students. That's what cults do.
The I and the T are really closely related, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. If you can control the flow of information, and then the whole thing is set up by this sort of cult of confession. The leadership sets the impossible standards to which you cannot live up to these standards. Then, of course, you fail. Then you sin. You've got to ask for forgiveness. You confess your sins, and you've got to police your own thoughts and honor. And you go down this ever descending spiral, and you're never gonna succeed in it.
Yeah.
Is it fair to link this restriction of other knowledge, for lack of a better phrase, and fundamentalism to the Genesis 1 narrative of the Garden of Eden and the fruit of the tree of knowledge is a bad thing? Is there a connection there, or am I just seeing connections where they don't exist?
You're just making it up, man. I don't know.
Okay.
Actually, no, that's a good thought. I've never thought of that. Maybe there's something to it. That might be that's a postmodern sort of interpretation. You're deconstructing, see? Derrida he'd be proud of you.
Well, there is something interesting in that, Matthew, that there is the idea from the heart of Genesis. I don't, Clint, were you ever a young Earth creationist? Matthew and I both were.
Sort of. I was never really taught it, deliberately. I guess I just sort of picked it up. I just always believed that the text was basically historically accurate and, factually true and all the rest of it.
Gotcha. So in some sense, the genealogies just sort of suggest that the Earth is pretty young.
That's it. Yeah. That's how they came. That's how they obviously arrived at it, when they just added up all the genealogies and got back to about 6,000 to 10,000 years. And well, that's when creation happened. So that's it.
Right.
Problem solved.
So there is, Matthew, I think you're right that there's a fear of knowledge that starts early, even if it's not so insidious right up front that there's still knowledge today that that somehow kills us. But certainly there's this idea that certain kinds of knowledge lead to sin.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's not a very far stretch, actually.
That would make a good blog post somewhere, I think.
Yeah, well, one of the other reasons why it's occurring to me, I mean, it was the idea popped into my head purely from the conversation you two were having, so it's a half-formed thought anyway. But something else that's occurred to me in this in the last few minutes is because of the podcast that we do, Still Unbelievable, Responding to Unbelievable podcast, and trying to publicize the podcast that we do to a Christian audience, is we've been contacted by people who are deconstructing, and one of them in particular has certainly said to me, I can't remember if it was on air to Andrew or rather on a conversation with Andrew as well, or whether it was just me, but that's not relevant. But what this person did say to me was they said that they were reading other books and there was good arguments and good knowledge that was conflicting with Christian belief and it was creating doubts. Well, the response from the Christian was, "We'll stop reading those books then."
Yeah. Exactly.
And so there is this just, if anything's causing you a problem, shut it down, gouge out the eye. It's this whole kind of, it's basically the seeds of a cult, isn't it? Cut yourself off from anything that causes you to want to leave this little huddle that I've created for you.
Well, I remember getting it. I used to work with a guy that was a painter and decorator, and he was a pretty straight up conservative Christian, and I had just finished reading the Da Vinci Code. And I asked him one time, I said, "Hey, have you ever read the Da Vinci Code? I just finished it, and it was quite interesting. I wondered what you thought about that." And he immediately, he's a super mellow guy. He just exploded and went on this rant about, "I don't read books like that. That's going to introduce seeds of doubt. I only read the Bible." And he just went on and on. I was kind of sitting there with my jaw open like, whoa, exactly that same kind of response. I was completely shocked by that vehement response. That he was so, because the Da Vinci Code made you question the Bible and Christianity and everything else.
Mm-hmm. You guys may both remember that in the book of Acts, there's a book burning at Ephesus. Mm-hmm. And when I was in Bible college, I had a professor who openly praised the book burning in the book of Acts.
They were doing the right thing.
Right, we should gather all those secular books. We should
burn them up.
Build a bonfire to the sky.
Just like in Florence, Savonarola, they did the same thing, didn't they? The bonfire of the vanities.
Yep.
Burn all the wicked and evil stuff.
Yeah, it's
amazing.
And it's quite shocking. It really is. So, Clint, we've sort of tackled a lot of topics in more or less an organic fashion, but in regard to your article, in regard to the 16 ways that people can deconvert, what do you want the listeners to hear most about deconstruction?
I would say that you're safe to explore multiple possibilities, and that you don't have to, it's not like you have to pick one and say, okay, that's me for the rest of my life. No, you're going to shift potentially along a spectrum. And so it's all about the journey. I've had people come back to this article even 2 years later or so and say, okay, I was here 2-3 years ago. Now I can see that I've moved over to this other part of the spectrum, and I think I might not stay there either forever. And that's quite a freeing sort of thing, I think, to go, okay, yeah, I can see how I've moved and I've shifted. My own beliefs and my own worldview has changed as I continue to deconstruct and then reconstruct. It's a process. It's a journey.
Can you see, so we have some Christian listeners, and I want to be as fair to them as I can. Well, Matthew, do we have Christian? Hopefully
there must be
got
some.
A few. There must be.
I hope there is. If you're a Christian listener, please let us know. We promise not to eat you. Maybe your babies, Matthew, but not you.
Matthew promises. I don't necessarily. No.
So wrong.
Tell me this. In your view, so most listeners probably know how I'd come at this, but I think it's fair to ask. Do you think it's possible to lead a Christian life and to be honest with the world around you, to see things rationally through the Christian lens? Sorry, I know that's a big question. Yeah, sorry.
It is, because you have to ask which Christian lens, of course. I mean, which one? Fundamentalist,
right.
Liberal,
35,000 Christian denominations in the world. Okay, pick one. Okay.
Lutheran, Calvinist, which lens, because that's I think that really gets at the heart of what we've been saying, is that when people start to deconstruct or ask questions, they've got to look at their own theological context around them. That what's your belief system? What were you taught? What was your theology? What is your theology? And are you okay with that? Because I see now, even going to Bible college, okay, I went to a fairly conservative evangelical Bible college in Portland in Oregon, but what it did for me, though, it exposed me to other interpretations, other traditions, and that immediately opened up my world a lot bigger. And I thought, okay, so there's a lot of traditions, there's a lot of possibilities. That can only be a good thing, to be exposed to other points of view. So even if you stay a Christian and you realize that my tradition isn't necessarily the only one and it's not the only right one, I can look at other possibilities, and that right there gives you permission to start to explore different streams and traditions.
But my Bible college, we didn't have any such enlightenment. It was Church of Christ, the incredibly conservative sort of Southeastern Church of Christ. We were a cult. And, enlightenment was not a key feature of our study. It was about why we were right, not about educating students on how to be cosmopolitan in their views, which is hopefully a feature of good education, right? To teach.
I was going to say that wasn't. I wouldn't say that was necessarily the aim of my Bible college. That was as a sort of an unintended side consequence of just reading articles and books. You're going to eventually come across. You read a commentary, and they're going to give you 2 or 3 possible interpretations of a passage, let's say, of the Bible. And you're going to go, okay, so 1 interpretation, 2, 3, 4, let's weigh these up. Let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of each. That's critical thinking, isn't it? As you're going, there's other possibilities. And that right there is going to open you up. But I will say, on the other hand, we had firestorms of controversy when I was a student there over some professors who were deemed liberal, who were just trying to advocate for more women in ministry. So we had one guy hauled up before a committee, and there was like a firestorm because he was daring to say women should be in leadership in churches. So, we weren't completely enlightened by any stretch.
That's interesting.
It's funny you mentioned that. I remember when I was still a Christian, the last church my wife and I were at, and the pastor there, genuinely lovely man. I got a lot of time for him. Really, really liked him. And he took to the church meeting to have an assistant pastor. And so this lady came and visited the church and preached on a Sunday. And we had a church meeting to talk about whether or not she was suitable to come along and be an assistant pastor at the church, so she'd be junior to him. We were just reading her bio, and it turned out that her and her husband were each on their second marriage. And I asked him, do we know the circumstances regarding the failure of the first marriage? And he said he didn't know, but it was before both of them were Christians. And for me, that was it. That was a non-issue after that point. But there was this sense that it seemed to change the focus of the meeting, and there seemed to be a lot of talk then about she's on her second marriage, there's this, that. And I left that meeting regretting that I'd ever brought that up.
Yeah.
Because I just felt ashamed of the meeting and some of the conversations that were said after there, and I just left that meeting after that with a really sour taste in my mouth after what happened after that.
It's true. I mean, I remember sitting in a class in Bible college with this one particular professor waxing eloquent about how Jesus was against all forms of divorce, and if you're divorced and then you get remarried, you're committing adultery, and there's no other possible interpretation other than that one. And a friend of mine who was divorced but wanted to get remarried walked out of there literally in tears. And I remember him standing out in the hallway outside the lecture hall weeping because he said, I am now, I guess, destined to be single for the rest of my life because I'm forbidden from being remarried. So that, that's the legacy of an interpretation like that. It's very devastating.
It is. That's for the listeners who care. That doctrine comes from two verses primarily, Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9. And we had the same doctrine, and I'll just relay a really quick story. I've got an elderly uncle, and he and his wife, my aunt, passed away relatively recently. They were together for over 60 years, and I know they loved each other because you could watch them together and see that there was genuine care and consideration between the two of them. But he confided in me. This was actually 6 or 8 years ago now, before she was sick. He confided in me that one of his regrets in life was that she was the only person he ever dated. And so they were both from the Southeast, right? Big, buckle of the Bible Belt, all of that sort of thing. And this sort of Christian mantra played a big part in his lifelong decisions. Now, I am not suggesting that they'd have been happier if they split up. Like I said, I think they genuinely loved each other all the way to the end. But what I am saying is that that's not true in all relationships. It's possible to be in relationships that you do need out of. And where Christianity does harm is by telling people that are in relationships that are codependent or self-destructive for some reason, or just because one or the other or both are not getting their physical and psychological needs met. This is where Christianity does harm, is by not allowing people to seek their best lives.
Well, and that's the whole point. It's a good case study. I was going to say my example of it is my parents, who were quite conservative fundamentalists. They boycotted my oldest sister's wedding years and years ago because she was marrying a guy who had himself been divorced before he became a Christian. And like you said in your example, that it was before he was a Christian. Now he's a Christian. He wants to marry my sister. They refused to go to the wedding because citing that verse that they were committing adultery. And then, ironically, she then became pretty much trapped in a loveless marriage with this guy. She never left him, though, even though she was miserable for over 30 years. He finally passed away. At which point she then said, now I'm free to remarry because I'm a widow now. So that's the only biblical grounds for me to remarry. So you base these interpretations from a couple of verses of the Bible. Look at the real damage it does in real people's lives. Right. These are concrete examples of, like you said, the harm that Christianity or a particular interpretation can do to people.
I'm curious, just because sometimes you can turn on my my theological geek side, and so I'm curious whether you had the guilty party doctrine. So the Church of Christ that I was a part of had a guilty party doctrine where the innocent party could remarry, and so the only reason for divorce was adultery, and the adulterer couldn't remarry, but the innocent party could. did y'all have an innocent party, Doctor? By the way, Matthew, that's how you say y'all.
Y'all.
Did y'all have
y'all.
Y'all.
I remember hearing that view, and that's having that discussion with my friend who was weeping in the hallway because this professor was advocating something he called the divorce myth. He actually wrote some books on it and that's his argument. There is no such thing as divorce. Anyone who's divorced is committing adultery who remarries, period. There's no grounds for it. Even he would discount the sexual infidelity and all the rest of it.
Wow.
So it was pretty hardcore. So
that is.
Yeah, I can remember saying that to my friend, saying, yeah, but your spouse committed adultery and now you're in the process of getting a divorce. According to how I read it, you're free to remarry because that seems the biblical grounds. But that, ironically, now he is remarried. So I guess he must have come to that conclusion.
I hope he's happy in his life. This has got to be.
I don't know. He's a pastor of a church, so I'm not really sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
The professor that I was telling you about that praised book burning also taught the guilty party doctrine, but he had this to say about the guilty party doctrine. So he and your professor probably would have gotten on like a house on fire. They'd have loved each other.
As long as there's books there.
Right. So what he had to say about the innocent party doctrine is he accepted that it could be a legitimate biblical stance, but that in his time, he was in his 60s at the time that he was my professor. In all of his years and our term was gospel preacher, in all of his times as a gospel preacher, 40 years thereabouts, he had never run upon an actual case of an innocent party. And so he was of the view that you could drive someone to adultery by not meeting their psychological or physical needs, or by simply not being there when they need companionship or whatever. And so he said he accepted the guilty party doctrine, but he'd never seen an innocent party. So
it's purely hypothetical.
Right, exactly.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
that's the kind of stuff that tells women to stay in abusive relationships with their Christian husband, isn't it? You don't. If your husband's not cheating on you, you've got no reason to leave that guy. He could be beating you and psychologically abusing you and all the rest of it. Women in churches are being told that all the time, to stay in abusive relationships because he's not having an affair. So you have no grounds for divorce.
On the flip side of that, so I'm just changing to a slightly more positive note on that. I remember being at a house group again years ago because I was a Christian, and there was a lady there, and we were talking about marital relations, etc. And I remember her excited and with relief pointing out how that she'd been encouraged that actually it was okay for her, if she was feeling that way inclined, to seduce her own husband.
Okay.
Interesting.
And yeah, I know. And I remember sitting there thinking, you've never been okay trying it before? And I just felt so sad for her.
But I think the whole discussion about this, to me, again, it goes back to, it's a case study because it's illustrating how people approach Christianity and the Bible, because they're saying, okay, it's inspired, it's inerrant, or whatever their view of the Bible is. It actually has bearing on the way I should live my life. It tells me what I should do, and that brings up the layer of, yeah, but it's somebody's interpretation of, so the pastor's up there telling you this is what you can and can't do, what you should and should not do, as I interpret this Bible on the podium and telling you what to do. So the whole thing is open to so many abuses within that system. It can be incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
So on the subject, oh, sorry, Andrew, I'm going over you again.
Oh, I was just agreeing. You go ahead.
On the subject of interpretation, and I probably really need to get this question out there for the sake of any Christian listeners who are listening, isn't it just possible that the reason why the three of us have gone apostate is because we had the wrong interpretation. And if you're going to have the wrong interpretation of Christianity, then it's hardly a surprise that it's all gone belly up. How do we respond to that kind of challenge back?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We could be just getting it wrong. We could just be reading the text wrong. But that again, going back to my list, there are some people on that list who stayed Christians, but they've had to radically revise their view of both God and the Bible. So yeah, I can stay a Christian. I just need to change my hermeneutic, basically the way I read the Bible and the way I look at God. That is an option, just to say, well, I'm going to disagree with my old position, but I'm going to broaden things out now. So I think, for some people, they do find a home there. I don't know what your other thoughts are, but.
Well, my thoughts are that there are so many different interpretations, both of people who have left and both of people who have stayed. So staying in itself or finding a way to make it work for you isn't in and of itself a validation of the belief. That would be my response to that. And that's probably my best response. So I don't know how I would go beyond that, because I don't see how any response back from a Christian could change that statement.
It could be just a way to quell the cognitive dissonance. Maybe that's all it is.
Yeah.
I've changed my interpretation, so I don't feel so worried about me going to hell or something, I don't know.
I guess I have two problems with Christianity today that remain unanswered. I'm not claiming to be infallible in interpretation. In fact, I'm happy to say that I'm quite fallible. But if I am fallible, then it's up to God to provide an interpretation that is somehow greater than my fallibility, if you see what I mean, right? So, but that's not actually my problem with Christianity. My problem with Christianity today is not in interpretation. My problem with Christianity is in contradiction. And so I cannot, at this point in my life, accept an all-loving and all-hating God. Those things do seem to me to be fundamentally orthogonal to each other in a way that just they can't be reconciled. Maintaining an eternal torture chamber for the people who didn't get it right strikes me as a contradiction, but even if it weren't, it wouldn't be a God that I could worship. But my second problem is actually the greatest one. The Bible, at least Christianity, makes some great claims about the Christian God, that he's all-knowing, that he's all-powerful, that he's all-present, and he does or doesn't have an eternal torture chamber, that he can rightly divide the good from the evil with perfect certainty, that he has the capacity to impart to others the ability to live forever, and the list goes on. It's not like you guys need me to tell you what the list is. But here's the problem. The Bible can't answer whether any of those things are actually true. Is there a God that can live forever? Well, you can assert that in a book, but it takes a long time to live forever.
Can't validate that. Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's circular logic too, isn't it?
It is. And the same thing is true for a God that can rightly divide the good from the evil. Now, I'm not saying that it would be impossible to convince me of those things. But the Christian God isn't trying to convince us. These are all the answers that we get after the game is over. After the king has been captured, that's when you get to find out, oh yeah, there was this guy behind the curtain, winding the gears of Oz or whatever game he's playing. And without those fundamental questions answered, without those assertions being addressed directly, I conclude that even if there is a God, he's not one for whom I have justifiable faith.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's probably why I was an angry theist for so long, because I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is the God, as I read the Bible, he commanded genocide. He had all these horrific laws in the Old Testament. And yet there's all these people sitting in church worshiping and praying and saying they love this God. And I'm going, wait a minute, this God commanded genocide. How can, and you say God is the same yesterday and today and forever. So it's the same God. He hasn't changed. What happened to that aspect of God, the one who commanded genocide and those horrific things in the Old Testament? And there's all kinds of answers for that, of course. I know all the answers, but it's unsatisfying. It doesn't work. It
Right.
didn't work for me anyway.
Right.
Yeah,
Nor
those
for me.
things would be a blocker for me if
It's a huge problem.
in going back. They weren't why I left, but they would stop me
Yeah.
going back.
I can't worship that God. There's no way. And when I hear hymns and things that I used to sing, that can be really triggering because they're filled with a lot of theology about, I'm such a worm and I'm such a lowly person, and God, reached down and pulled me out of the miry clay and the pit and all the rest of it. I don't want to see myself as that kind of person. That's very debilitating and very mental health, from a mental health point of view, it's very damaging.
Right. You're not fundamentally broken.
And sinful and everything. Right. But that's what Christianity says. You are.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that because I've said this to someone before, I can't remember who, and I don't have any evidence on which to claim it as a belief, but I would love somebody to be able to do a study on it, and I don't think I have got the right skills to do it. But I do think that there are issues with young people and single people in our churches, and poor self-esteem or even mental health issues. And I think it all boils down to the Christian message of you're a wretch and you can't do anything with God. In my memories of being a youth worker in church and part of a prayer team in church, and people coming and just feeling wretched about themselves and struggling, and they've got these loads and loads of self-esteem. I just remember lots of people with self-esteem issues, and I think it does tie down to this doctrine of you're worthless wretch and you can't do anything unless God helps you or does it for you. But it's beyond. All I have is this gut feeling and this tying of theology. I need somebody who has actually done the study and got some academia to tie it together. But I'm pretty sure there's a correlation there.
There is. It's the religious trauma syndrome. I've got an episode coming up with Dr. Marlene Winnell, who basically wrote the book on RTS, and we just did a discussion for a podcast coming up, and she talks about when you indoctrinate young children who grew up in a fundamentalist or conservative church with exactly that doctrine, it's very psychologically damaging. It's sexually damaging, and on and on. And it has been documented. So yeah, people have done that research, and it's quite shocking when you see what it does to kids, especially growing up in these churches.
Do you know who Dr. Darrell Ray is?
Oh yes, yep. I had him on the podcast last year.
Okay, I haven't gotten that, so my apologies. I'm not that far into your back catalog, and I listened to 3 episodes just last night. So I'm looking forward. Yeah, I told you I like your podcast.
Binge listening.
Well, I am, and that's
you can get treatment for addiction, Andrew.
That's right.
Well, it's kind of addiction. I don't have a problem.
First thing is denial.
You can stop anytime you like. Yeah.
That's exactly. Right. I can stop anytime I want. Yeah, so don't need a 5-step to this one. I'm happy to. So the listeners ought to know. I mean, there are some things that we want our listeners, we want them to tune into, and some things we like more than others. I genuinely like your podcast. I sincerely hope that they will come and have a listen, because I think it's worth listening to. And so it's interesting that you're doing another podcast on recovering from religion and religion and abuse and that sort of thing, because that's a big deal to Darrell Ray. Yeah.
Recovering from religion. Yeah, exactly what it is. That you have to do that, that you have to recover from religion. You shouldn't have to.
That's exactly right.
We're all doing it.
Right. He's touched my life. I'm actually a hotline agent at Recovering from Religion.
Yeah, you were saying.
And I don't talk about the things that callers say when they call on mic very often, but they're truly heartbreaking. They're truly heartbreaking stories of abuse and neglect, and And sometimes it's just intellectual curiosity that people, sometimes it's very mild. Like, I feel like I can't read this other source about Christianity that I'd like. So sometimes it's lighter and it doesn't have earth-shattering or at least life-altering consequences. But so many calls that we get are people that have their lives permanently altered by religion, and they can't leave because of the carrot and the stick.
Mm-hmm.
If I leave, I'm going to hell. If I stay, maybe this will all be worth it. Maybe the fact that my preacher abused me for 5 years as a child, and the fact that my minister is taking advantage, these real incidents. I'm not making any of this up. I won't say who the people are. My preacher takes advantage of me now. I've been taken advantage of as a child. That if I just stay, heaven will cure it all.
The sunk cost fallacy, isn't it? A lot of it is.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, it is. And I hadn't put that quite together like that. So it's nicely done. Yeah.
That's what it is. It's the longer you go with it and you see that it's damaging to you, but you think, if I just keep putting a little bit more into this, it's going to come around someday. It's going to pay off. And it's a money pit sort of thing, Right. It's exactly what it is.
Rolf DeBelly's book. I'll have to see if I can find it. But if people if they like that kind of thought fallacies, Rolf DeBelly wrote a great book on it. I was the thing that made me think of it was you identifying the sunk cost fallacy like you did. That's one of them in the book. So, that was nicely done, nicely identified.
But it's part of the cult psychology. That's why I immediately, when you started describing it, I was like, oh, that's what he's talking about. It's the way cults are able to keep people in for as long as they do, because it's like Scientology is a classic example. The money is a clear-cut case of the sunk cost fallacy. People spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and they just keep stringing them along. You're going to break through in the next month, in the next year, and just another $5,000, another $10,000, another $3,000, and they just keep doing it. They think, oh, this isn't getting me anywhere, but they just keep plowing money into it.
Right.
Classic case.
That book, if you're interested, is The Art of Thinking Clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Rolf, R-O-L-F, D-O-B-E-L-L-I, and it's fantastic. Something like 100 different reasoning errors that are identified in the book. Really, really a nice piece of work. Matthew, I sense that we are.
No, not yet.
You're not sensing anything.
You're sensing wrong, eh? It's that malfunctioning Mac of yours. What is? Clint, have you had any feedback from Christians on your list?
See, that's the funny thing. I don't really get any feedback from Christians other than the occasional evangelical troll on Twitter or something like that. But the people that I hear from the podcast are, deconstructing. They're going through all the stuff we've been talking about. They found the show. They've stumbled across it somewhere or saw it on Twitter or something. And so they're grateful for the kind of the way that you can sort of put the pieces together. So that tends to be the kind of feedback that I get from most listeners. I don't get that many Christians on there. Maybe that one Christian that's listening to your show will check me out.
Please give us some feedback, Mr. One Chris, or Mrs. One,
Mr. Mrs.
whichever, whoever you are.
You're out there somewhere.
But have you had much engagement with Christians on the reasons for people leaving Christianity? Because my experience, I want you to answer first, but as a hint, my experience of conversations or trying to get Christians to understand reasons for leaving very, very rarely go well at all.
Yeah, I was going to say the ones that I do have, their stock response is, well, you were never a Christian to begin with. And that's the simple solution in their mind. You weren't a Christian, so you were a false Christian. That's the only way. So you've fallen away. If you were a true Christian to begin with, you'd still be a Christian. So that's kind of the stock response that I tend to get.
It's the most common response that I get, variations on that, and it is, by a long margin. It's way more than 50%, probably even more than 3/4 of the responses I get is you were doing it wrong, or you were never fully saved, or you really are saved, or you really do know God exists, you're just burying it at the moment, or you just wanted to sin. It's all variations of the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely. It's quite. It used to make me really, really angry. It used to be my hot button, and as soon as somebody went there, I would just
really
come
triggered.
at them with absolutely triggered. But again, now I've resigned myself that this is something that's not going to go away, so I respond very differently. I'm very firm in my response, but it no longer makes me cross and angry the way it used to.
But even the response, I mean, I tend to do the same thing. I'll say, well, I went to Bible college, seminary, blah, 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 blah. I was a pastor for 12 years. I was a Bible college teacher for over 20 years. I was in ministry. I taught this stuff. I preached it. I studied Greek and Hebrew. I mean, I don't know how much more proofs you want. I was probably way more of a Christian and studied it way more than that person who's telling me I wasn't a true Christian. What about that? And then, like you say, they'll come back with something. You're just suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, man. You just want to go say, okay, whatever. I can't prove it, so they just double down.
And it's hard to. Do you have a good response to that? Because I've tried various responses, and I'm struggling to have a good response to that, because once somebody is set like that, I found that it's very hard to get them to listen to you.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, we know this is true, that people rarely change their points of view when you present factual evidence or whatever. I mean, whether it's politics or religion or whatever it is. So you're not going to convince them, probably. You just say, look, we're going to have to agree to disagree. It's very threatening to them. I think they see us as sort of a contagion. Not we're talking about the coronavirus, but it's like a spreading contagion that they need to fight against. And so it's very threatening. If it happened to us, it could happen to them. That's a critical one. So they can't entertain the possibility that it could happen to them. So they've got to stuff their fingers in their ears and double down and go down that line.
So, in case it's not come out in the last hour and a bit that we've been talking, what one thing would you want a Christian listening to this, struggling with why and the reasons why we've left, and reading through your list and struggling to engage how somebody could end up multiple steps down that list? What one nugget would you want them to take away to consider?
I would say having that, you've got permission to explore other paths, and like I've been saying, you don't have to think, okay, I've got to slot into this one forever. You're going to probably change your perspectives as you start going down that line. But for example, in my case, I got into progressive Christians. I was a kind of a progressive Christian for about 5 or 6 years. That opened me up to a lot of other things. And I see now, looking back 15, 20 years later, that was a necessary step in my sort of evolution. So that was hugely important at the time. And now I see, it was really a good step that I went through. That I didn't stay there, but it was really good to work through that phase, I guess, if you will. So I have a lot of respect for guys like Rob Bell and people like that, because they helped me move from sort of point A to point B or C down the spectrum. So don't feel like you have to stay somewhere forever. You can be open to other possibilities.
Okay. And funny you mentioned Rob Bell, and Rob Bell was Crumb's 4 years ago now when he did his Year Without God. It was quite some time ago now. And there have been other high profile exes since then. And more recently, there's been Rhett and Link YouTube stars. I will confess I have no idea who they are. I've not watched their channel, but they've got a blue tick on their Twitter feed, so they're clearly known to a certain demographic.
Come on, man. Good Mythical Morning. You don't know Good Mythical Morning.
I'm clearly too old for this thing. There is so much media out there, and I drive to work and I listen to podcasts. Something has to go, so I don't YouTube, and that's the line I've drawn. I've got a teenager at home who YouTubes. I don't. I podcast, and I'm quite happy with that. So What do you think the message is that's coming out then about these high-profile leavers?
That is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I haven't followed Rob Bell, so I'm not familiar with what he's done. That's interesting. Now
He
it makes me.
podcasts Life After God. It's quite a good podcast. I really enjoy it.
Oh, right. Yeah, because I used to listen to the Rob casts, and that was good about 3 or 4 years ago. But then I thought, yeah, I'm moved past that. I'm not, where he's at anymore. I was once, but he's still got a lot of good things to say. We went and saw him up in Manchester a few years ago. I thought that was really good. It was just really kind of a refreshing talk. So I got a lot of time for Rob Bell, but now it makes me want to go back and research what he's doing currently because I haven't followed him.
And do you think it's important that these high-profile people, because there's been a couple of worship leaders as well, haven't they? Who made this big announcement and then they've gone silent.
Well, yes.
Do you think it's important that these people announce loudly that they're leaving, or do you think it's just better for the world if they go quietly?
Well, what's so interesting, I think, is the responses that we've seen from the concern. That's where I'm fascinated by. I can't remember who the guy's name, but there was it was an ex-worship leader or something, wasn't he?
Was it Joshua?
The kiss dating goodbye guy. That was
Joshua McDowell, is that right?
Yeah, no, not McDowell.
Josh Harris.
Josh Harris, that's the one.
Okay. That was a big one. He denounced his book and all the purity culture stuff, and the firestorm that came after him.
Yeah.
That and you heard all the same sorts of responses that we've been talking about. Well, he was never a Christian to begin with,
Really?
Yep. And you go right down that line. So that's where they're coming from. They have to come from that point of view because if they entertained any other possibility, he was a Christian and then he left. Now he's an apostate. What does that mean?
Yeah. What's your response when you see this section of Christianity that chews up people like that? Because I can't think of a better way to describe it, because the things that get written about Joshua Harris and Rhett and Link, I included a link to one article written about them in our email exchanges, and other. There are Christians, vocal Christians, who really chew them up. What do you think when you read that kind of thing?
It strikes me that it's the cognitive dissonance side of things. You have to, when you're experiencing any sort of cognitive dissonance, you have to have some way to quell the dissonance for your own mental health. And so when you see the response, you go, okay, that's it. He was never a Christian. Thank God for that. I'm fine. I guess I'm okay. He was never a Christian. Well, we can dismiss him and move on with our lives. And that's kind of where I go down the cult psychology route and think, okay. That's how I see it now, is like someone has to make a big point that he was an apostate, and some high profile leader will write a Facebook post or a blog article or a Christianity Today article or something, and that settles that. That's done. We can dismiss him now. He was never a Christian. It's just that easy.
Yeah, it is easy, but the trouble with easy is it's often wrong.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that bothers me about that kind of item is it's somebody from afar, possibly never even met the person involved, and I've been on the receiving end of this kind of thing, who diagnose what their mind state is remotely and says this is what they're thinking effectively,
and why they're doing it, what their motives are. And
I know, and it's when I read those bits, that's when I shake my head and go, really, you don't know anything.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's it, and that's the whole thing, isn't it? It's just a way to dismiss the person out of hand, and like you said, they don't know anything about that. I mean, it's the same kind of thing when I was a pastor of a church. I was a pastor for 10 years, and I had all these great things that I was doing. And then when all the stuff started getting really nasty, people started lying and gossiping. The people believed the worst things about me that weren't even true. And they were talking about me behind my back. And I'm going, wait a minute, you've known me for years. How can you turn around and treat me like this, knowing the track record that I've had? It meant nothing. and people that didn't even know me were spreading gossip and lies and rumors. So you think, okay, well, that happens in churches, so why not in the wider world of Christianity?
So, Clint, what would you do then if somebody, how would your response be if somebody came to you and said that it doesn't matter if they're a high-profile Christian or not? Let's imagine they are just for the kudos, and said they were struggling with their faith. They didn't really know where to turn. They needed some guidance. They needed to know that they weren't going crazy. What would you say to them, and how would you treat them?
That's a good question. I would say that it's good to have that dialogue, isn't it? Because you start unpacking. Okay, what are you questioning? What are your doubts? What do you this is a safe space. You can express any concern, any doubt, any problem, any issue. You're not going to get judged. I don't have a point of view. I'm not going to prop up a system. I'm not I'm not beholden to a church. I don't have to talk you into anything or out of anything. That's where I think that's where I go when people do come and they'll message me and things, and we'll have those kind of discussions. I like chatting with people on Skype or Zoom about those kind of things, and we just have these discussions, and I'll get into those questions about what are you struggling with, what are your doubts, what are your concerns, what are your problems. Let's talk about it. I'm not trying to convince them of anything. I just want to let them, kind of a counseling session, I guess, in a way. They need to unload and unburden in a safe place. That's probably the biggest thing, without being judged or talked into or out of something. That's the problem with Christian counseling, from what I've understood, is that they're generally going to try to convince you back into the church. They're going to say, well, your problem is you've got sin in your life. You need to get back into the church. You need to submit to your husband, or that kind of thing. And that's quite damaging. It could be for a lot of people. I'm not doing that for sure. Yeah. I'm not going to tell you got to read your Bible more or pray more or whatever.
And have you had people contact you in that situation?
Yeah, and like I say, I get a lot of people that message me on Twitter. They'll DM me, and I'll say, hey, let's chat. Let's do a Zoom call, or let's do a Skype chat or a Facebook chat. And so I've had some fantastic discussions with people that just found me on Twitter or somewhere on social media, and we'll just talk about where they're coming from. I just talked to a woman last week that came out of the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church with a horrific story, and we probably talked for a good 2 hours.
Wow.
And she just found me on Twitter. Next thing I know, we're having a 2-hour Zoom call. It's fascinating.
That's also, and Andrew and I have had similar. And when I was deconstructing more than 10 years ago, I didn't have the ability to connect into that structure. I was reading blogs of a few exes, and there was a lot of pain there, and I was conversing there, and there was a little bit of community there, and I blogged about my story, and we kind of all commented on each other's blogs, but there did seem to be quite a lot of pain in there from people who were still Christians, which was really hard. I didn't have the ability to be able to process all that. And I needed somebody to talk to. And I looked around my friends. My entire friendship circle was Christians. And I went through them in my head, who can I talk to? Who can I talk to? And there were probably as many as half a dozen who were probably people who I trusted enough to be able to talk to. But I didn't, because as I analysed each individual, I realised I didn't know any of them well enough to know how they would respond. And it was that not knowing that stopped me from saying, I'm having these doubts. I think I'm on the way out. But I really, really needed and really, really wanted to talk to somebody about it. And I think the closest I got was a girl I knew. I'd been her youth leader for a while. I genuinely trusted her, and she was in a relationship. She was married to somebody, but when they first got together, he wasn't a Christian, and I hadn't realised that he'd converted. So I said to her, "How was it for you deciding to marry so and so when he wasn't a Christian?" And she instantly said, Oh, he converted before he got engaged. I'd have never got engaged if he wasn't converted. You know, it was at that point I said, okay, I can't tell you.
Yeah.
And
got to find a safe person for sure.
yeah, it did need to be. So I went through that entire process, 3 years of deconstruction, completely alone, and it was terrible. And I didn't even tell my wife until a couple of years after it was a done deal. And that causes its own world of pain. That itself is not a good. And the only reason I ended up at that place was purely the fear of the conversation I was going to have with Christians, because I didn't know somebody like yourself who I could connect to have a live chat, to talk through what was going through my mind. So I guess the message that I want to give to anybody listening is, if you're in that situation, seek somebody out. You're in a better place now than I was 10 years ago in terms of access to people who actually care, who will create a safe environment for you. So go and find that. You'll be amazed how great the EXA community is at dealing with strangers, people they don't know, who are having these doubts. Don't fear us, please. There are some great people out there. If you don't trust myself and Andrew, that's fine. There will be somebody out there who you can trust.
You can trust me.
Use a Windows user.
Okay, we can't trust him. Well, I was going to say, on your point about finding, sometimes you got to form a new tribe. Well, that's one piece of advice. So if you go on Twitter and just do a search on hashtag #exvangelical, you'll find a lot of stuff. You'll start connecting with other people in that community just on Twitter, for example. And so that's one quick and easy way in terms of social media. You can read books, like you were saying, articles. Tim Sledge's book, Goodbye Jesus, that's a good one. He was a evangelical pastor of a mega church in Texas, big leader in the church, and he became an atheist, and he describes his whole journey in that book. It's a fascinating book, so there's people out there you can connect with. But if you look at the definition of religious trauma syndrome, it's a double whammy, because on the one hand, you're getting traumatized while you're in the religion through the abuse and everything else, but then when you leave it, as you described, that's the trauma, the grief, the loss, the betrayal, so there's another thing on the back end. You've got to work through that as well. So it's a double whammy, really.
For those listeners who might be young atheists, if that's an okay term, recently deconstructed, and for any Christians listening, if you need more than an electronic connection, if you need a voice, if you need someone to talk to, sometimes these things hit us hardest in the middle of the night, right? When we're alone and connecting on Twitter or whatever just doesn't feel like enough. Go to recoveringfromreligion.org, click on the Hotline Project, call the number on the screen. Not only will you find a friendly voice, you'll find someone like me who genuinely cares, though it'd be very unusual to actually get me if that's who you were looking for. But one of the things that we have at the fingertips of every hotline agent is a database of local groups all over the United States and sometimes all over the world, just depending on where you are and how up to date the database is, of atheist groups, of agnostic groups, of free-thinking societies, and we will not only talk to you about these things when you're at your lowest point and you really just need someone to talk to, but we'll help you look the stuff up on the internet. We'll walk you through the process. We'll send you an email, and you can call us back anytime. To recoveringfromreligion.org and click on the Hotline Project. I can say that, like I said, the stories are heartbreaking, and sometimes it is that loss of community that is hardest. It's that who am I now moment, and that keeps a lot of people wedded to religion when they really don't want to be. Because sometimes even a bad friend is better than no friend at all. But there are ways out.
Absolutely.
And I tell you, it sounds like you can connect with Clint on Twitter.
That's true.
You can Zoom call, you can Skype call, you can, maybe even phone call, depending on if you're in the right part of the world. But do connect, because the thing that is hardest about leaving religion most often, the story that I hear most, is how lonely it is. And it doesn't have to be lonely.
Right.
Okay,
So
sorry.
true.
Done with the sermon.
I thought it was an advertisement.
Equivalent of Nelson Moore, we need to find some organ music to play over that little section.
Stir the heartstrings.
Oh, nicely said.
I have just one more question, I think, to throw at you, Clint, unless there's more that come up. A question which I'm faced with because I'm an active and loud atheist in a sea of Christians where I am. A question that gets thrown at me an awful lot, more out of incredulity than anything else, is why do you have to do that? Can't you just go quietly and not make a ripple? Why is it so important for the likes of Andrew and I and yourself and the many other such podcasts that exist to fly our atheist flag in the way that we do?
I would say, though, I'm not trying to convince anyone in or out of anything. You know what I mean? I'm trying to get people to think critically. That's my goal. And I do get emails from people who are really angry atheists, and I'm not, you guys don't strike me as being that way, where you're out to fully disprove Christianity. They're gullible fools. They're blah blah blah. I'm not doing that. I just want to talk to people. I want to engage with people, and if that gets you to think and question your reality, then I feel like I've done my job. You know, so I don't get. Maybe that's why I don't get attacked by Christians. I don't feel like I'm coming after the church. I used to, but I don't do that anymore. I just talk to people who and they tell their stories. It's hard to argue with somebody's real life experience, isn't it? This happened to me. So you do with it what you will, but this is my story, you know, and you're going to identify with perhaps some or all of it. And that's very powerful.
Yeah, it's true. I'm not an angry atheist, though I will say that as an atheist, there are things that can make me angry.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Right. But in general, from a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, I realized that being angry at a being that doesn't exist just seems ridiculous. It's, you know, how can you not laugh, right?
Shaking your fist at an empty sky.
Right, exactly. It's why be filled with impotent rage over a being that, okay, and that sounded like a very affirmative statement, like I'm the atheist who says that no God exists, like I'm taking an affirmative position. I'm not. Though I think I am in the place that Isaac Asimov was in when he was asked about God. He said words to the effect that he did not know that there was not a God, but it was no longer worth his time to investigate. And so, no, I don't know that there's not a God hiding on the backside of the moon that the Chinese rover will dig up, momentarily, or that there's one hiding out under the ice on Europa or whatever. But even if there were, if it's not a God I would worship, it's not a God I should be mad at. Though the misconduct of the Catholic Church or a fundamentalist Mormons who have, yes, that will make me angry.
Yeah, that's the thing, is the dangers of religionism. That's right. What I'm right with you. I get upset about the damage that religion has done historically and is doing right now. That's something to be upset about. Whether is that God's fault? God may not even exist. But
Right.
there's harm being done right now to millions of people all over the world because of religion. So you can't deny that. In my book, that's something to be upset about.
Right. Absolutely.
And that seems like a good moment to close then, unless there's any more questions from anyone or comments from anyone.
We certainly covered a lot of ground, didn't we?
We did.
We did.
Thank you. I have no idea how well we followed my bullet pointed list because I haven't even got it in.
Oh, wait, there was a list?
I think it was in an email somewhere. It always seems so righteous and great to put
Great
up
idea.
a list, and then you get to the conversation and it goes way off.
Yeah.
Thank you
The
so
list
much.
looked. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say the list looked more like a modern art masterpiece than an actual list. It was just sort of these various dots on a canvas. But, Clint, I'll say this: that in the run up to this show, this will be my final words. But Matthew, that means that you've got to give the get in touch bit, which means I know I'm going to take abuse for the PC Mac thing. That's fine. Clint, I'll tell you that in the run up to this show, Matthew and I were hugely excited to talk to you. And so we have covered a lot of ground that has been very organic. But the reason is that we had so many things that we wanted to talk to you about and just, we were excited to have you on. And it's been a genuine pleasure.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
To have you on the podcast.
Yeah, I've absolutely enjoyed it. I love, chatting with guys like you. You just start going and everything bounces off each other, and we're talking about Trump 1 minute and evangelicalism and this and that, and just sort of goes everywhere.
Yeah, very organic, but a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you, Clint. Cheers, Andrew. Yes, so. Yeah, we got you on to talk about your podcast and about your list of reasons why people leave. We've moved around on that. We're planning to do multiple other podcasts on this subject. I'm guesting on Skeptics and Seekers tomorrow evening for another episode on that. In fact, you'll probably hear the Skeptics and Seekers episode before I've edited this and uploaded, purely because of the different turnaround times on the two podcasts. Thank you so much, Clint. We've hinted offline that we might try and do something else, a repeat or whatever. We'll work that out and announce it in due course. If we can get you back on, we'll probably do that. We absolutely intend to do some more episodes on the whole subject of exit from religion and how you do it and how you process and asking. We haven't really addressed the questions in this episode of how would we go back or what would take us back, other than we can't see how we could. That's not the fullest answer that we could possibly give. If you're a listener who wants to talk specifically about that subject, maybe you're a Christian, you want to challenge us on some things on that and have a conversation of a similar style to what we've just had, please get in touch. These are definitely more conversations in this subject area that we would like to have. Thank you so much, Clint. You can find Clint on the Mindshift podcast. Make sure I think there's multiple podcasts called Mindshift, so make sure you find the right one. Don't do what I did and spend a few weeks listening to wonderful episodes on education, wondering when the religion bit is going to come on. Unless education is your piece? Yeah, unless education is your thing, then by all means go and do that. I'm not saying it's a bad podcast. It's just not Clint's podcast. And there's Clint's list that we talked about earlier on the Medium website?
Medium.com.
Medium.com. You can contact Andrew and myself at reasonpress.net or reasonpress@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening. See you again next time. You have been listening to a podcast by Reason Press. To get in touch, email reasonpress@gmail.com or see our website, reasonpress.net, where you'll also find our book, Still Unbelievable. We welcome more feedback, and you might even end up on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. You can hear more of her music at soundcloud.com/hollybishop. You can support us by buying some of Holly's music and telling her we sent you.